Okay, and welcome back. So before we leave the Veneto and Venice, there's one last Venetian we've got to talk about. And that is probably the most influential of all Venetian artists or architects that ever existed. That's Andrea Palladio. Andrea Paladio is an interesting character. He was an architect of some consequence towards the end of the 16th century. It's really funny. No one really quite knows how to categorize Palladio. He is sometimes described as a Renaissance architect. He's sometimes described as a Mannerist architect. And sometimes he's described as which might be proto-Baroque. Remember what I said about proto? Anytime we say proto, it means we have no idea what we're talking about. But that's actually pretty apt because he presages what happens in the next century. And he's actually more important not for what he did, but for what he wrote. He actually had a fair number of commissions and was a successful architect, but it's not his commissions and his architectural pieces that made his reputation. It was a set of books that he wrote called the Four Books of Architecture. And he was an antiquarian, much like many people, many of the humanists during the Renaissance. He collected works of art, but he also collected books on architecture. And one of the most important books of architecture from the ancient world are the 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius. Vitruvius was an architect writing in the 2nd century, and he wrote a whole series of books. And Andrea Palladio wrote 4 books. The presumption is that he intended to write 6 more, but he died. He died before he had a chance to get to it, and so we only have his 4 books. But those 4 books then went on to become some of the most influential books on architecture that ever existed. In fact, we use Palladian as an adjective. You can tell that you've really changed the world when your name becomes an adjective or a verb. You know, it's one thing to be an artist, it's another to become a verb or an adjective because you now have changed the world. You could go into any Home Depot, any big box store, and you can find things described as Palladian. Some of them are Palladium, some of them are not. As a style of architecture, as a form of architecture. And he sets that standard. And what communicates the standard is not necessarily his works of architecture, but his actual books. So why were the books so unusual? Well, the books were so unusual because they had full and complete architectural plans, floor plans, and cross-sections. And you're looking at me now and you're saying, well, duh, how do you have an architecture book without plans? And that's exactly right. Because if you actually cracked open Vitruvius's 10 books of architecture, Vitruvius's book was not originally illustrated. That sounds remarkable to us, but this is actually something that's true of ancient books. Most ancient books were not illustrated. If you crack open like Ptolemy described the shape of the universe, but Ptolemy never ever drew a diagram of the universe. Instead, what he did is he gave out proportions, formulas, rules for how to find these stars. It was, reading an ancient manuscript like, Ptolemy or Vitruvius is really, really difficult because instead of nice, tidy illustrations and diagrams that explain everything, they actually just give you tables of numbers and formulas, and you have to figure these out and plot these out yourself. Now, there is a virtue to that. It means that if you have the numbers, you can do it and you know you're doing it directly. But as far as communicating a concept or a principle, it's very, very hard. Now, why is that? Why did the ancient world not use illustrations? It's a really baffling question. It may be they did, and those illustrations just didn't survive. Another reason is that, well, it's hard to copy illustrations. There's too much variation between one illustrator and the other. And if you're writing on scrolls, those scrolls have to be rolled up. And as you roll those scrolls up, it flexes and it causes the ink to fall off. So drawings don't really survive well in that environment. It's not until we get books and not until we get printed books that you can have reliable illustrations, because you know that illustration is going to be the same because it's not being copied by a monk who copied it by a monk who copied it from another monk, where you have all these errors creep in. It's going to be printed right from the printer, and you know it's going to be the same as the thing that you initially illustrated or commissioned. And so you see a huge explosion in both scientific and technical illustration from the 16th century onward. I know a lot about this because actually my dissertation actually hit on this. I actually was talking about I actually wrote my dissertation on the illustrations of a book by Cosmas Indikoplaustes, and his book may be the first science treatise that was ever fully illustrated with diagrams. It's really kind of remarkable. It's funny because nobody believes his theories, but his illustrations were very important. And so it's kind of hard to believe that up until the 16th century, books didn't have a lot of illustrations in them, at least not technical illustrations. There were illuminations, but those were narrative devices. There were not a lot of technical illustrations, things like floor plans or scientific diagrams. That took a long time to enter into the visual vocabulary. But right from the get-go, Palladio's books had beautiful illustrations. Here's the frontispiece, and you can see these are things that he drew himself and sent to the printer so that you could get a sense of these buildings, and anybody could replicate. His was illustrated with, I believe, over 200 unique illustrations, which is an astonishing amount of illustrations for the time. There really weren't a lot of illustrations. And so that means that anybody could look at one of his projects. In this case, he has the Villa Rotonda, and you could replicate it. So this was one of those things that was built during his lifetime. As far as his theory goes, he really was looking for geometrical perfection. He was building on the works of earlier Renaissance architects, Serlio, Alberti. We didn't talk much about them, but they're there. Alberti wrote a book on architecture, but it isn't nearly as well thought out or didactic as Palladio's book is. So you can understand why Palladio's book becomes so influential. In this building, the Villa Rotonda, that is here in the floor plan, you can see it's perfectly symmetrical. It has a classical facade on all four sides. All the rooms are symmetrical. It is both radially and bilaterally symmetrical, so you can slice this several different ways, and you get an equally proportioned building out of it. These ideas of pure symmetry are actually more Renaissance than they are classical, but remember, the Renaissance is always interpreting the past out of its own tradition. It assumed that the past had more knowledge than it did, and so actually Renaissance architecture is more geometrically structured. You have all these videos on YouTube that try to prove to you the perfect geometrical alignments of ancient structures, and they're not so perfect. If you actually get there with a surveyor's stick and a measuring tape and a theodolite, you'll find they kind of fudged things. They kind of fudged things in the ancient world when they couldn't quite get them right. But the Renaissance was very, very particular. But of course, nobody believes that wonderful buildings like these were built by aliens, but they should, because they're so perfect. Anyhow, so what will end up happening is that Palladio's 4 books of architecture become the kind of gold standard for what defines classical architecture, and they go forward in time. What ends up happening is that these get picked up by Lord Burlington. Lord Burlington is living in the 17th century, and he translates a new edition, and he adds another level of illustration to it. So he nearly doubles the numbers of illustrations. So he translates it into English. That translation of Palladio's works will eventually wind up on the nightstand of a guy you should know, a guy by the name of Thomas Jefferson. And we'll talk more about Thomas Jefferson and Palladian architecture in the future, because it's Palladio's books that... Palladio. I keep changing my pronunciation. It's Palladio's books that actually spark off neoclassical architecture. Lord Burlington will build his Chisholm house in a Palladian style. He will make his own translation of the books. Those books wind up on the nightstand of Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson uses those as inspiration in his own architecture. Yes, Thomas Jefferson was an architect. According to legend, Thomas Jefferson had 2 books on his nightstand. These were books that he constantly consulted. And the first was this crazy translation of the New Testament that he was always working on. And the second was Palladio's 4 books of architecture. On Thomas Jefferson's epitaph, He made sure that it recognized what he considered to be his principal achievements in life. First is he was the author of the Declaration of Independence. The second is he was the author of Virginia's freedom of religion laws. And the third was that he was the architect for the University of Virginia. So it shows you, we don't often think of Thomas Jefferson as an architect, but he did. And he gets his inspiration from Palladio. So Palladio is going to emphasize symmetry, order, but he also does something else. And you can kind of see it in the works that were finished after his lifetime, stuff that he started and laid out the plan for. And my favorite example of this is Il Redentore, which is the Redeemer, which is a church in Venice. Il Redentore is this Baroque style church. I can't really say it's Baroque because Baroque doesn't really happen to the 17th century, but it shows us where the architecture is going. First of all, right on the facade, you can see we've got some very strange things going on. We have what appears to be a typical classical facade, kind of pediment, colonnade, they're attached colonnades, but churches have side aisles, which is something that Greek temples didn't have, so he just puts little, kind of half pediments out there to cover up the side aisles, to create a more imposing facade. He places a dome over the crossing, but the building gets even stranger when we look into the interior. Usually there would be a kind of square transept here, so it could be a Latin cross church, but he replaces these with apses. And then the side aisles, instead of just being separated by columns, they almost become like little chapels in and of themselves, each with an apse on either end. We're starting to get these curvilinear shapes or variety of shapes, even where they don't make sense. That is, in classical architecture, even though classical architecture could do some wild stuff, there was a certain logic to them. You never put an apse in a place where a colonnade would be more appropriate or would do. But we're seeing that architecture is getting more experimental. We're breaking away from the rules of classical architecture, and we're saying, yeah, I'm going to throw an apse in there just because I like it. When you get to the interior of the building and you get to the sanctuary, it's where it gets really strange, because here we have an apse, but the apse is made of a colonnade. You can see that a little bit better here. So here is this colonnade of an apse of colonnades, and then it opens up to a space beyond. Now look at how powerful this is when you look to the interior. We have a curved, architrave here, and you see a colonnade, but you can actually see it beyond it to a space. So it becomes like a screen facade. It breaks off the space and allows light to come in from another space, but it still allows it to be open. You can also see the apses to the side that open up, and also you have these large, what we call thermal windows, because they're based on bath architecture, that allow light to come into the room. And you have this wonderful vault, which is a strange vault. It's not a kind of traditional vault. Comes to a point here, but has these large kind of undulating surfaces. And it allows more light. It creates a far more dramatic space. And this is something that's going to change in architecture and also in art. Classicism was about rediscovering, at least classicism in the High Italian Renaissance, was about rediscovering the rules of Greco-Roman art and architecture. And so it's very controlled. It has a sense of calm about it. But as we move into the Manneristic period, and especially we move into the Baroque, into the 17th century, it's going to get less orderly and more muscular, more robust, more melodramatic, and more theatrical, and more experimental. They're going to start doing all kinds of crazy bat guano stuff because they want to emphasize the drama, not the rules, not the order. I always find it's interesting when my wife looks at art, which she doesn't very often. I love my wife to death. That sounded like a slam. It wasn't meant to be. But we don't have the same taste in art. I like contemporary art. She doesn't like it at all. But when we look at this era, she likes Renaissance art because it gives this sense of order and calm. I'm much more a fan of the Baroque style because it has this sense of drama. You may have noticed I'm a bit of a drama queen. I don't know if that's come through the lectures. I tend to be pretty reserved, but you may be shocked to know that. Anyhow, which gets us into the next phase. Mannerism. So Mannerism is a style that doesn't really have any concrete time period. Most people agree that by the time we get to the middle of the 16th century in Italy, we are moving into Mannerism. And by the time we get to the 17th century, we've moved into the Baroque. You can think of Mannerism as perhaps this interregnum between the High Renaissance and the Baroque. That's not to say it's insignificant, that it's just a transition period. It's not. It has its own unique characteristics. But it is certainly bizarre. The reason we call it Mannerism is because maniera in the Italian means it's after a style, after a fashion. And this is where we start seeing this undulating swing of the pendulum in Western art. What do I mean by that? That is that since the Renaissance, there seems to have been a kind of rhythm that develops in art. And this rhythm seems pretty natural. What happens is you have a classical movement that tries to come in with strict rules based on classical prototypes from the Greek and Roman period. But you do that for 30, 40 years and people get bored. It starts to lose its expressiveness. That's the thing about rules. When you have too many of them, you lose a quality of expression. So people start getting experimental. And Mannerism is the first time people started getting experimental. And then eventually what will happen is people say, okay, this experimental stuff is getting a little bit too over the top. We need to rein it in, give some order back to life, get back to basics. And you can see this kind of move from classicism to experimentalism, and this fluctuates, and the pendulum swings back and forth all the way up through the 19th century. You'll see a more experimental age, like the Baroque, and then the Baroque goes into something even more experimental, like, say, Rococo, and then it swings back hard to neoclassicism and academic styles. But then in the 19th century, it swings away to more experimental styles, to things like Impressionism in the 19th century art. And then ever since modernism, I don't know, I think it seems like the pendulum has got swung so hard that maybe it hit the wall and got stuck in the wall. Or maybe it hit the wall and shattered into 1,000 pieces. We don't know. But you will see this kind of undulation, this kind of movement of the pendulum back and forth as styles change. People get bored with a style, they say, that's it, we got to do this. And then we got to experiment. And then they'll get, over to the top and people say, okay, this has just gotten too crazy. We got to get back to basics. And you'll see that happening all the time. I've noticed it, quite frankly, in the last 20 or 30 years that there's been a huge upswing in naturalism and traditional painting. When I went to art school, yes, I went to an art school, no one could even teach you naturalism and academic art. Or if they could, they didn't want to admit they could because it was so out of fashion. But now there's lots of people who do it. You can see them on YouTube. It's been a real resurgence in naturalistic art lately. So maybe the pendulum has swung back most recently. So Mannerism is typified by this experimentation, and the figures are going to get long, attenuated, weird. It's the kind of stuff that Michelangelo was experimenting with towards the end of his life. In fact, many people would consider the later phase of Michelangelo not to be Renaissance, but to be Mannerist. So let's talk about some of the best Mannerist painters. Bronzino. Bronzino, and unfortunately this is one of the best best portraits of him I could find. He was a Florentine painter. He's active in that time period where we have the restoration of the Medicis. So long story short, Lorenzo de' Medici dies at the end of the Quattrocento, end of the 1400s. Medicis go into brief exile. Savonarola takes charge. They want to burn down all of this humanistic classical art. Then he gets booted out, and then eventually the Medicis have a return to favor, due in not small part because they managed to put their relations on the papal throne. That always helps to have the Pope in your back pocket. And then they put their relations on the papal throne, and then they get restored to become the Dukes of Tuscany, and so the Medicis come back bigger than ever. And so he becomes the court painter to the Medicis at this time period. So this is a return to kind of splendor for the Medicis. And he's a portraitist and a classical painter. What I mean by that is he's very famous for painting portraits of high-ranking individuals, but he's also important for painting classical themes. But while they're classical in subject matter, they're going to be a little bit off. They're not going to be the high-end classical style that we're used to. Let's take a look at his portraits. Now, if you're making a portrait, the portrait has to actually look like the person you're painting. That's kind of what a portrait is. And so those are going to be a little bit more reserved, but they're absolutely fabulous. Painting in oil, painting on panel. Here you have Eleanor of Toledo and her son. You'll notice that her face has this beautiful oval shape. Mannerist painters loved to give these elongated forms, so they're not going to paint people with rounded heads. They like to keep them painted oval. Notice she has a very long neck, and notice she has very long fingers. So look at her hand. Her hand is this long, elegant, languid thing lying on her lap. Even her son is a little bit elongated in that regard. So the proportions are stretched. And then there's all of this emphasis on the detail, the surface of her dress, the beauty of the textiles, etc., the lusciousness of the pearls. So this is like stylization. What we mean by stylization is, yes, it's naturalistic, yes, it looks like the person, but he's definitely playing with proportions and attenuating the figure to give it a certain style. You can see that same thing in this portrait of a young man. This guy, he's wearing this beautiful slashed black doublet. In the 15th century, in the Quattrocento, colors were in fashion, particularly reds and blues, these vibrant colors. But there is actually a turn in fashion, and black comes in the 16th and the 17th century and becomes the kind of color of professionals, of elites and nobles. So, if you ever wonder when, black became when they always say, well, orange is the new black, like, for example, that joke, when black became black was in this time period, in the early modern period, when black became such an important color. So here you can see this doublet is just fabulous. It has all these slashes in it to reveal the material underneath. This, of course, means you have to use a lot of fabric, so this is clearly very, very wealthy. All of this is meant to indicate wealth. This is probably a member of the Medici household, although no one's entirely certain of the identity of who this portrait is. But again, you can see he has this very oval-shaped head. He has this long torso, and he has these long, elegant fingers. I love how his fingers curl over into the book and wrap around the sash at his waist. We have these rich surface details, but a very attenuated figure. So his portraits are a bit more reserved, but when he paints classical subject matters, things start to get a little weird, and you can start to see this. So this is Bronzino. This is a classical subject. This is the allegory of Venus and Cupid. And this is a famous story that comes out of the life of Venus. Venus, shall we say, got around. And she ended up, sleeping with most of the gods. But she was married to Hephaestus. And so we have this scene where we have this figure, possibly Hephaestus, over here pulling back this curtain to kind of expose her. And here she is with her son in a rather erotic pose. This is Cupid, or Eros. You can see his wings here. And then we have other people, this kind of anguished look going on back here. And so this is an allegory of Venus and Cupid. But once we get past the basic mythology of it, things start to go weird. Take a look at her. Her head is so small in relation to her body. Her fingers are so long. But it's Cupid that's really bizarre. He's cradling his mom's head here, reaches over to touch her breast, so that's a bit strange. But then his booty is twerking out here. His back bends this way, and his neck is behind her shoulder. But how on earth could a human being get their body into that position? You have this very bizarre body that kind of ignores anatomy. You have these exaggerations in the arm of this figure here. This figure who's standing in the background, where does her head connect with her body exactly? It just kind of disappears behind this putti. A putti is a kind of boy. Puto is a boy. Putti is the plural. And these are attendants to gods and goddesses. And then it's like, how on earth does this possibly connect? The anatomy is distorted. The figures are attenuated in bizarre ways. There is a kind of claustrophobic feel to this painting. Notice that there's no open space in this painting. Everything is crowded up to the foreground. There's almost no depth to it. Everything feels like it's a shallow, stage-like space. and it's crowded with strange iconographic details. She holds one of the golden apples, so this kind of indicates the judgment of Paris, but there are other kind of details as well. She holds the arrow that is the arrow that Cupid uses to make people either fall in love or to hate each other. Cupid has arrows of lead as well as arrows of gold. The gold ones make you fall in love, the lead ones make you fall in hate. So just remember that next time you see a Valentine's Day card. It goes both ways. So you can kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. This is not the way that someone in the High Renaissance around the year 1500 would have painted this scene. Venus would have been standing. There would have been open space and negative space. It wouldn't have been crowded. We wouldn't have had these strange, jangled, diagonal lines everywhere. It would have been ordered and have some breadth. So you can see what the Mannerism is doing. Mannerism is experimenting, going in a different direction. You can really start to see this in the works of, say, Pontormo. Pontormo was started as a classicist. He was a very strict classicist, but then he starts moving into the Mannerist and starts becoming even more experimental, active in the Florentine area as a Florentine painter. And here's, you can see an example of this. Again, this is the Deposition. This is a Christian theme instead of a classical theme. But notice how tall all the figures are, how small their heads are relative to their massive bodies. Here the body of Christ is being taken down from the cross and is about to be buried. And you see that he has this kind of massive body. Everyone has these really long fingers, these dramatic expressions. The color choices are more in the direction of pastels and light colors instead of these kind of deep and robust colors that we've seen before. This figure who holds Christ up on his shoulder, how is this working exactly? Because his back goes up here, and then his shoulder is here. It's almost like and yet this is his head. It's almost like his head, if you saw him, he wouldn't have a head and an even set of shoulders like this. No, he would have, he'd have a head and one shoulder that went all the way over here, because how else could that work? How else could he support this? So you see that, and again, you have the diagonals. Notice all the strong, jangled diagonal lines. Figures are not standing upright. They're bent, they're squatting, they're twisting, their feet are crossed. They have all these dynamic poses. Again, this is all the feature of the Mannerists. The Mannerists are experimenting with poses, experimenting with anatomy. And if the anatomy isn't right, who cares? What we're doing is we're trying to emphasize a feeling, a sensation. And you'll see that continuing on. And that's where we get to Parmigianino. Parmigianino is the little one from Parma. That's what his nickname means. He's active in Parma and Rome. He was actually born Francesco Mazzola, but most of these artists are known by their nicknames. And he was something of a child prodigy. He is probably the premier Mannerist painter. When you think of Mannerism, he's going to be the one that you think of. And here he is, as a very young man, painting a picture in a convex mirror. Now, a convex mirror is a curved mirror, which means it'll distort the image. So notice that his hand in the foreground is enormous compared to his head. Notice we have these distortions. So people have speculated perhaps it was the use of convex mirrors that create these anatomical distortions in the paintings of the Mannerists. Maybe so. It's always hard to say. Some of the distortions seem like they could be inspired by some of these distortions by looking in convex mirrors, but maybe the others are just inexplicable. They seem to be the choice of the artist. In any case, why would you want to distort the human body? It's clearly a choice. Whether they got the inspiration from the convex mirror or not, it's a choice. They're making choices. And you can see these choices in the works of Parmigianino. Here you have, again, a Cupid. This is Cupid shaving his bow, getting his bow ready. And I just want to point out how ridiculously tiny his feet are, how small his feet are. And then, he has these small feet, he has these really long legs, and these enormous glutes. And then again, his shoulder is here, presumably his other shoulder is here. that should make his neck about there, if you think about it logically, but instead his neck is here. His head has been moved way over to this side, presumably because he didn't want his head to conflict with the wing. So that's something a Mannerist will do. A classicist will really try to make the anatomy correct. A Mannerist will say, what am I trying to say? Screw that, we're going to move the anatomy to fit the composition. So the whole head gets shifted this way out of the conflict with the wing so that he can look back at you. Quite frankly, there's still something of a Mannerist even in today's art. One of the things that you may know is, okay, so if you're a fan of video games, movie posters, or comic books, you will notice that the anatomy on a lot of comic book figures, and even on movie posters, even when they're real actors, are not accurate. You can particularly see this in female poses. Poor Scarlett Johansson. Scarlett Johansson is always put into these torturous positions where, to be blunt, you can get a look at her backside in the catsuit, but she's still somehow turning around to look at you, and they're just the most impossibly awkward positions. So we still do this. I mean, we still torture figures and, engage in stylization. So, we shouldn't be too harsh on the Mannerists, because when you look at our comic books, and especially when you look at our video games, we exaggerate all kinds of proportions in human beings, because again, it's not about the figure. It's about trying to emphasize or stylize certain things. Again, you get little Pooty in the background fighting various kind of different sharp diagonal lines, breaking up the composition. Almost no negative space. It's just crowded up. It fills the picture plane. This one I find just the most baffling, and it shows that time and space and proportion have absolutely no meaning in Manneristic art. First of all, look at the horse. So it's not just human anatomy. We have this enormous backside on the horse. It's a teeny bitty head. I mean, this long neck. How does that even work? When you look at Paul here, Paul has this arm, and the arm is depicted as if foreshortened, yet the arm is kind of facing away from us. It actually should be more here to be that foreshortened. He's extended it out, but the muscles are clearly foreshortened, which is kind of awkward or odd. Notice also that we have, again, kind of strong diagonal lines. We do have a bit of a background here, but it almost looks like a postcard. It doesn't actually look like real depth. The most bizarre thing here happening is the story. The story is, of course, the conversion of Paul. Paul is knocked down on the road to Damascus. Paul, of course, originally was Saul. Saul is persecuting Christians. He goes on the road to Damascus to persecute more Christians. On the journey, he is struck down by God, and God says, Paul, why do you, kick against the pricks? And this is where Paul has his Damascus moment, road to Damascus moment. He converts to Christianity, and he becomes one of the greatest apostles of Christianity, as opposed to one of the greatest persecutors of Christianity. So the artist here is trying to create this visionary experience. What's interesting is when you look at his eyes kind of look upward, but a little bit to this direction. His arm is out this direction, so it's almost like you'd expect him to be seeing this direction as a vision is presenting itself in this direction. But here is where the heavenly light is, and it's shining here. But it doesn't matter anyway, because if you try to think of this in 3 dimensions, he is in front of the horse and the horse is behind him. How can he even see the light here? So you're meant to kind of connect them together, but it doesn't work. The space and the dimension doesn't work. This light would be far, far behind his head. He'd never be able to see it. This is the kind of thing that a Renaissance painter would think about. Are these things believable in space? Could they actually see the people they're interacting with? But the Mannerist painter says, screw that. We can go from 3-dimensional thinking to 2-dimensional thinking immediately. Everybody will make the connection. We don't even have to worry about it. And of course, the greatest and best example of this is going to be the Madonna of the Long Neck, one of the most accurately named paintings in the world. And again, he didn't make these titles. These titles are actually made after the fact. But when we look at this again, perfectly oval face, long neck, sloping shoulders, her waist, I mean, you can see her navel there, her body is here, And then look at her lower body. It's just enormous. Look at her leg. How big it is. You can see the same thing. It's like you have this, again, figure behind that has this enormously long leg, teeny little feet, and then almost no torso, almost no waist. Holds a vase, and the body just kind of disappears behind the vase, and it's like, forget it. We don't have to make real anatomy. We'll just make the head on the opposite side. Dramatic drapery. And then we have this kind of extreme foreshortened perspective, so that we have a building back here with a colonnade, but the column goes to where exactly? Where is this thing going, and how is this building resolved in the background? Nobody can quite tell. And then we have a figure here who, again, is, his head is tiny compared to his massively long body. And this is presumably a prophet. He holds a scroll. This is probably one of the prophets of the Old Testament, probably Isaiah, who is prophesying of the intended virgin. But if we try to make his sense of him in the perspective, he's too far down in the scene to be this small. He's too close to these figures, so the perspective isn't accurate. So after this wonderful invention of mathematical perspective and creating believable space and depth, artists just say, screw it. We're going to make them the size they need to be to fit them in to tell the story. But the weirdest thing to me is this baby. I mean, it's got feet that look like it's about 6 months old, but the body, it looks like it's a 4-year-old, and the head is this strange, almost alien-like figure. And then we have all of this wonderful attention paid to the drapery, the surfaces as well. All of this is sacrificing realism and naturalism for expression. Expression becomes more important. Art is never about naturalism. It's always about expression. Even naturalism is a kind of expression. But this is where you can see them playing around, having fun. And then we get to Cellini. The same things happen in sculpture. So Cellini is a goldsmith and a Florentine sculptor. He bakes his reputation on making these beautiful objects. And this is a salt cellar. So you sit down to eat dinner. You need salt, you need pepper, you need a salt shaker. And that's what this is. It has a little bowl. There would have been a little golden spoon, so you could dip your spoon in the salt and sprinkle the salt around. So a little bit fancier than your salt shaker, I'm guessing. I don't think you could find this at IKEA. So Francis II is the Holy Roman Emperor, so very powerful guy. So he is I think that's correct. I think Francis II is the Holy Roman Emperor. Don't quote me on that. I may be wrong. But so he's a very important person, and so he's making this for him. And so all of this beautiful sculptural decoration is just in service of this idea of salt. Where does salt come from? It comes from the sea. So a very way to show that allegory is to depict Poseidon, or Neptune if you prefer, the god of the sea, with Amphitrite. Amphitrite is his queen and his counterpart. And so we have the god and goddess of the sea, but then we have all of these other rich details. So you have the horses, the sea horses. Notice that they are depicted as horses, but with finned forelegs, and all of these other luscious details. But when you again look at the figures, compact heads, long hands, long figures, wonderful complex diagonal crossing figures. They're not just standing there to be admired, they're just this jumble of figures. Cellini's reputation gets him to this, which is probably his most famous commission. This is the Perseus, and this sits in the Loggia, which is right in front of the Uffizi, which is the primary museum in Florence. And he's responsible for all of the sculpture here, all of everything on the base, as well as the statue. Now, so what we see here is a scene from the life of Perseus. Perseus, of course, is this hero of the Danaans, this tribe of Greeks in ancient Greek mythology. He is given he's a son of Danae, and he is the son of Zeus, so he's kind of a demigod. I guess I don't have to explain that anymore. We live in the age of Percy Jackson, so thank goodness for Percy Jackson, bringing back Greek mythology. And he holds aloft the head of Medusa. But everything about this shows you this greater exaggeration. take a look at his hair. When we look at his features, his hair is this mess of curls. We don't just get the head of Medusa, we get all the gory viscera hanging from her neck. And as if that wasn't enough for you, he stands on her body, and all the effluvia, the blood and guts and stuff is coming out of her neck. Oh my gosh, look at this poor woman. Not only did she get her head cut off, she's really been tied into knots. She actually reaches back to grab her own ankles. Her body is contorted, and he stands on top of her. Look at his forearm, how stressed it is, and how individuated the muscles are around the knees and the kneecap. So really kind of exaggerated details. You get more of this kind of exaggerated details in his helmet. His helmet has this kind of strange, not quite dragon, not quite griffin creature. It has wings, has these swooping curls. These things are just over the top. According to legend, if you look at the back of his helmet, the back of the helmet has this kind of face with wild eyebrows, and then the hair coming off of the back of Perseus' neck makes up the beard. And this is supposed to be a self-portrait of Cellini. When we look at the face of Medusa, she has all of these writhing snakes for hair, all of the blood coming down, and then she has these barely open eyes. And I love the angle of the eyes, because anyone standing there, she gazes down onto you. There's an entirely different feeling from a Cellini than any of the other statues in the loggia, because rather than being kind of classical and meant to be admired, it very much interacts with you. It looks at you, it confronts you. The statue was seen as a kind of a miracle, and frankly, it was one of the largest bronze castings of its time, and it was done in one casting. So instead of being cast in several different pieces and brought together, which was the kind of easier way to do it, he boasted that he could do this in one casting. And the truth is, he really didn't know how to do it, but he pulled it off. And so as he was casting it, the problem is when you cast it into a mold that big, the mold is just a gigantic heat sink. And so the molten metal goes in and it starts to cool before it can flow into all of the parts. And he didn't have his mold preheated enough to prevent this from happening, and he didn't have the bronze hot enough to flow into all the places. So it actually started to congeal before he was done. So he ran around the house and they pulled everything they could that was made out of lighter weight metals, things like the pewter dishes, the silver candlesticks, the silverware, everything he had, and he threw it into the crucible because that would lower the melting point and keep it fluid. He almost botched this, but kind of in a miracle he pulled it off. So hey, dream big, always promise more than you can deliver. It'll push you to do your best. So he kind of pulled it off. And so he was a person of some cheek. You could imagine him as this character who promised more than he could deliver. But let me tell you that the biggest feature of this is its location. He knew exactly where this was going, and this is right in front of the Palazzo Pubblico. The Palazzo Pubblico in Florence, of course, is the famous location where is found Michelangelo's David. Now, this is a replica. The David was moved inside back in the 18th century, but this is where the statue of David would have stood in Cellini's time. And there's a number of other famous statues that were made as well. And you'll notice the angle right here. And of course, if you know the story of Medusa's head, the story of Medusa's head is that, you point the head of the Gorgon, and whoever looks at it turns to stone. So you can see his eye line is right to the head of Medusa, and here he is, a stone statue, so he's been turned to stone. So, and there's another statue that would have done this as well. So Cellini is putting this elaborate visual gag into the middle of the piazza. He's saying, here I am making these vibrant, lively statues, and you can tell they're very much alive. They have all this, they're exaggerated, they're not realistic anymore, but they're very much lively in their depiction with this, all the blood and viscera and the twisted body of Medusa at his feet. And what he's saying is, my art is alive, but the art of Michelangelo is dead. It has been turned to stone. So you may throw shade on someone, but you will never throw shade like Cellini threw shade. Throwing shade on Michelangelo, it's pretty hardcore, man. It's pretty hardcore. I don't know if it could be topped. So pretty impressive that he's building in his own visual gags to throw shade at Michelangelo. There's one last Mannerist painter that's at the end of the 16th century that we got to talk about, and that's El Greco. He was born Domenicos Theotokopoulos, but because that's almost impossible to say, everybody calls him the Greek. And he was Greek. He was raised in Greece. He was active on Crete. But remember that Greece is in decline at this time. Remember, Greece was where the Byzantine Empire was from. That's the end of the Roman Empire. You have this 1,000-year extension of the Roman Empire in the east, but it's a Christian empire. We call it the Byzantine Empire. But it was conquered by the Turks in 1453, May 20th, as a matter of fact. And so the Byzantines are in a state of occupation and also exile. And so there aren't many opportunities for an artist in that part of the world. And so you're going to move and find a different place to go. And so he starts off painting in what we would regard as a very Byzantine medieval style. This is one of his early works, and this is still in Crete. It's painted on a panel. Notice that it has all the features of Byzantine art. Gold background, chrysography, this outlining the drapery in gold. It's very flat, but it's not terribly realistic. It's, again, Byzantine art is concerned with the spiritual. The gold background is meant to let you know, hey, this isn't real life. You're looking at a vision of the spiritual life. In the Byzantine world, they call these things windows onto heaven. So you're looking into the spiritual world. And if you look at Byzantine figures, they are rather graphic. They are stylized. They are attenuated. They don't look realistic. They're meant to be stylized. Again, that's to say, not real life. You're looking at the spiritual realm. But he had talent and he had ambition, and so he eventually wound up in Spain, where he became the court painter. And so he started with his Byzantine training and upbringing, but quickly came to a lot of Renaissance training and became a master in oil painting. But he brings some of this experimental, graphic, Byzantine flavor to his artwork, and right at the same time that the rest of the world is beginning to experiment as well. So it's kind of a perfect fusion. It's a perfect storm of all of these elements coming together. He became a court painter to the court of Spain, and was really famously known for his portraits. And he's another one of these artists that is pushing the envelope in terms of surface. Remember how we talked about Titian in the first part of this lecture? Titian was one of the first artists that would let you see a brushstroke, that would say, hey, I'll let that. And the same thing is happening here. Notice that we see around the edges. As you move away from the face and the important details into the background or the hands, the detail becomes much less specific. It becomes more painterly. You can see the brushwork, the expressiveness of the brushwork. Eventually, as we get to the 19th century, the Impressionists are looking for a way to break free from the dry and dead academic styles of their time, and they will look for inspiration to painters, and they will look to painters like Titian and El Greco. They'll also look to painters such as Frans Hals and Velázquez, which we'll talk about. We'll talk about Velázquez next time. We'll get to Frans Hals probably a week from that. But they're looking for these artists that are showing more expression, that are doing more with less, that you don't need to paint every noodling detail, that you can let a brush stroke alone. You can give it this almost unfinished quality, and it gives some vitality to the painting. So he was noted for this, and really, it's a brilliant kind of technique. If you're painting something like silk, good gravy, silk has so many reflective surfaces. How could you possibly paint that? And the way to paint that is to not paint that, is to fudge it, to give all of these loose, gauzy brushstrokes that give you the sense of highlights and reflective surfaces. Same with lace and features. And so he was very successful in this regard as a portraitist. Even then, you can notice that the hands are kind of long, The faces are kind of long. They certainly wouldn't have been that long in real life. He gives a kind of exaggerated stylization, but like Bronzino, he's going to control it for his portraits. But when he starts getting to his religious subject matters, he's going to really let loose. Holy crap, how tall is Jesus? Is he 9 foot tall? Is he being recruited for the NBA? Anyhow, look how teeny his head is relative to his body. And look at all the wild ecstatic brushwork going on in the background, indicating the radiating light, and in the drapery, giving the surfaces. So this is the resurrection of Christ, and you can tell that, the armor here, this is supposed to be armor. He doesn't just have a blue body tattoo. He has armor here, but the armor is treated almost as if it's skin tight so that it reveals the anatomy. And you have these wild kind of colors. Manneristic color is going to be more experimental. And the figures are really tall. Again, really itty-bitty feet, tiny heads, long hands. And somehow this works. If you're thinking about the resurrection is this moment where God comes back to life. Jesus comes and he bursts out of the grave, and all of this long line and strange diagonal kind of crossing and figures emphasizes that he's exploding from the tomb. And it's a way of showing, again, this is the spiritual dimension, that you have an earthly dimension, and when you have an earthly dimension, you rein in the stylization. Just a little bit of stylization, but you rein it in. But if you're talking about the visionary world, the spiritual, the mystical world, you're not going to rein it in. You're going to let your freak flag fly. And one of my all-time favorite paintings by El Greco, then, is The Burial of Count Orgaz, where you see both of these mixed together simultaneously. So the Count is being laid in his grave. His family members, his attendants are all there. We have the bishop in all of his incredible vestments and finery. The Count is in his armor. You have these wonderful highlights, much like Titian attacked highlights. And they are laying him down. And all of the notables are gathered here. But notice the difference. There is a stark difference in the style of the scene above this line and the scene below. In the scene below, the figures are standing. They are not engaged in any kind of exotic or wild poses. Even then, as they cling under the knees of the Count, his body is twisted and diagonal. You kind of have these bent over compositions. But it's more or less pretty much reserved. And while the figures do have longer faces than we might expect, they're not so exaggerated as to be unbelievable. But then look at the scene above. So in the scene above, we have an angel who's carrying this ghostly figure, which is in fact a childlike spirit. And this is the spirit of Count Orgaz. So this is the Count being brought up into heaven. And as he gets into heaven, we're confronted with another Deicus scene. Deicus is a intervention scene. So we have this figure with his long wild hair and his animal skin clothes. And then we have this figure over here, which is the Virgin Mary. And this is John the Baptist and the Virgin Mary interceding before the throne of God on behalf of the Count. And then all around them are seated the angels and the saints. Peter is over here wearing his usual orange and holding his keys, has his short beard. That's how you can always recognize Peter. He has a pretty established iconography at this point. All the other saints are there. And notice again, we have these kind of jangly diagonal lines everywhere. Notice that the figures here are really attenuated. Mary's head is really small and her body is really massive. And they're even more exaggerated than the figures below. And so there's a sharp stylistic difference between these two scenes. And what he's trying to show you is the visionary space, the mystical space, the spiritual space in relation to the real, mundane, or mortal plane. And I love how he even communicates this with the actions of the figure, that down here, most people are looking or concentrating on the burial of the Count, but a few figures, such as this figure here, which may be a self-portrait, we don't quite know, this may be a self-portrait, are looking up. And then here the person, officiating over the Mass for the deceased is also looking up. That a few figures are seeing the visionary and mystical experience, and a few others are not. That some of these people are looking up and recognizing, oh my gosh, see his soul being taken up into heaven. And this is, again, a work that emphasizes the visionary or the mystical aspect of art, and thereby emphasizing the mystical and visionary aspect of Catholicism. Spain is a very Catholic country. The southern European countries tended to remain Catholic. The northern European countries tended to become Protestant. So this is, again, a work that fits into the context of the Counter-Reformation. In the Counter-Reformation, the Catholics decide the Protestants have gone against a lot of things that we have complaints about. Some of those things we'll consider reforming, but the Protestants hated art. They thought it was this form of idolatry, and they said, no. Art is a way of demonstrating the Spirit, and the saints and the tradition of saints are a way of demonstrating the Spirit. So we're going to double down on that. And again, you get this art that emphasizes how art is part of the Catholic tradition and how it really can show you these spiritual visions opening up. It's really an amazing piece. The sharp stylistic difference between the two shows how he could use style to express something more than just painting this if he had painted it in a purely naturalistic style, say as had been done around the year 1500 in the Renaissance. And you can really see these artists are experimenting. And this is just a small little painting relatively compared to some of these other big commissions, but it's a landscape showing a view of Toledo. And what I love about this is Toledo is almost an afterthought to this scene. This looks very flat. It doesn't have a lot of dimension to it. It's really about the wonderful energy and motion of the clouds and the plants and the trees. And these kind of energetic, expressive, visible, painterly brushstrokes, this visible surface, the tactile surface, is what's going to inspire a lot of the early modernists towards the end of the 19th century. Okay, so that's it. We're going to wrap up Mannerisms there. And hopefully you can see the trends moving forward, that we're going to get more experimental, more robust, more into this idea of art expressing the mystical, the visionary. That's a perfect place to leave off, because that sets us up for the Baroque. And the Baroque, again, doesn't have a hard start, but by the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, in Italy and in the southern countries of Europe, we're really going to see a new transformation. We're going to see this thing we call the Baroque emerge. And yes, I definitely will do dad jokes about the Baroque. How can I not? If it's not Baroque, don't fix it. Oh my gosh. Yes, I just channeled David Ogden Steer's Cogsworth, which will forever be better than the live action one. Oh my gosh. We won't talk about the live action Disneys. They do not exist. They are non-canon and forever and always. Okay, thanks so much. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.